Hello, I'm Brandon Clayton. I will be presenting Weber, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Singer from this week, week 4. Starting with Weber, Weber argues in Bureaucracy that it is fully developed only in the modern state, and that in the private economy it is found only in the most advanced institutions of capitalism. The reason that it wins is because of the efficiency that it produces and the predictability and controllability that it has in complex societies. Bureaucracy has defined roles. The work is considered a specialized task that takes trained professionals to accomplish. The offices have clear responsibilities that the individual must fulfill. Weber noted that, over time, nobles were no longer necessary and that the government, rather than granting a rite of passage into positions, began to look for trained professionals to hand tasks to. This obviously takes education to become specialized. Weber notes that this is not specific to bureaucracy, though he does point out that education used to be to cultivate an individual, and that it was a plus for cultural quality in the sense that you aim to be knightly, or a gymnastic humanist, or just a conventional gentleman, in which it shifted over to becoming a plus of expert knowledge. Moving on, hierarchical authority was created in the bureaucracy. In the sense, like a larger institution, you would have a supervisor, say one being a manager of a group of people, and the individual has a manager above them, who also manages a group of supervisors and to whom they also report. These organizations also follow general rules that create an impersonal environment. This is because rules tend to apply to categories rather than to the individual. Relationships are also meant to be professional within the organization or in a government position. Weber notes that the working hours may be limited. This also helps reduce factors like favoritism and emotional involvement in decision making. Then also, there is written documentation for such things as transactions, interactions with individuals that are kept in their original draft form. As well, policy is written around what the individual is allowed to do within the organization. Weber notes a shift in authority from traditional to a rational type. Authority used to be inherited, and the roles were fixed by tradition in the sense that you were born into them. People also followed tradition because that's how it had always been done, with loyalty being to the ruler rather than an office, which worked well in things such as monarchies, or that in a charismatic sense, they believed in their leader and that the leader inspired devotion, with authority being more emotional and personal, which, as we know, with monarchs, rules were made on the spot. However, in bureaucracy, with its rational legal authority, we see that rules are more legitimate and that authority resides in offices. There are procedures and steps that an individual must follow for decision making. Along with hierarchical authority, officials must possess credentials or qualifications, such as a degree or specialized training, in which an authority figure assesses and selects. This loyalty also shifted from the ruler to the organization, which is why this becomes a dominant form of authority, because people obey the rules in offices rather than people. Bureaucracy grows, besides what had been discussed, because it is just more efficient and precise at whatever it is trying to do or accomplish. In which Weber puts it best here: precision, speed, inambiguity, knowledge of the files, continuity, discretion, unity, strict subordination, reduction of friction, and of material and personal costs. These are raised to the optimum point in the strictly bureaucratic administration. This works well with capitalism because of the requirement for predictability, calculation, and control. With documents such as policies, capitalism can flourish because it relies on contracts, property rights, and legal obligations, and bureaucracy enforces and applies laws that consistently ensure they are followed, which reduces the uncertainty of doing such things. This also applies to large organizations. Democracy seems to have a love-hate relationship with bureaucracy. This is because it needs it to function, but at the same time, it is limited by what it can do. It helps with tasks such as governing large population, also to make laws more equal and organize elections. This creates individuals who are considered legal equals and reduces arbitrary power. Though not mentioned, it helps with tax collection so that government services may be provided or that officials appointed to office may be paid. Hence, it can serve as a paid bureaucracy, as mentioned before, which provides the expertise that democracy needs to function. The conflict, though, arises because the bureaucrats are appointed officials who are difficult to remove because elections are held. Along with specialization, people can influence policy outcomes, undermining democracy because they are accountable to citizens through elections, popular debate, and political participation. Then, since there is no regard for persons, it creates frustration among citizens. Finally, bureaucracy has this procedural secrecy side to it to maintain knowledge and manage its operations, whereas democracy is more open and transparent so that they maintain trust and accountability rather than concealing decision making. Next, we'll discuss Nietzsche and his chapter of Part 7, Our Virtues. This, I decided to try to condense it as much as I could to 1 or 2 slides, so please just bear with me. Nietzsche starts off with what seems to be a societal note, that we still wear the pigtails of our grandfathers. This gives the societal conditions that we follow, that our virtues in being good grandsons are not ours, but those that were socially passed down to us. That as well, we follow a herd mentality when it comes to morality. In this sense, we tend to follow what others deem morally correct, which brings us back to the big pigtails. This is because it is not the morality we follow for ourselves, but rather their morality that we have incorporated into our being. Nietzsche argues that the struggle for equality is the purpose of the need for the belief in God. That is also where atheism is found the most, in the sense that he is pointing towards how religious people become enraged when a vigorous opponent, such as an atheist, questions or points out how it is incompatible with the moral man. That, too, spirituality exists only as the end product of moral qualities. He also points out that a disinterested person is not all that virtuous. This is because they are said to still be getting something out of it, such as feeling himself more, and even goes so far as to call people blockheads for not seeing it. Then, when it comes to unegoistic, he sees it as a person being useful to someone else at their own expense, which he sees as a sin of omission, as is just another mask of philanthropy. He argues here that it is immoral to assume that what is good for one is good for another, pointing out that just because we think it is good does not necessarily mean that it is. Nietzsche points out that the hybrid European specifically needs costumes. The costumes they wear do not seem to fit, so they keep changing them. This reminds me of the mask that Carl Jung talked about. I think he's expressing almost the same thing, but rather than wearing a mask or being a different person in different situations, they are wearing costumes almost to see if that particular morality is suitable to their consciousness. In which Nietzsche does, towards the end, kind of mention things about masks and how people interchange them. Nietzsche sees society at that point as being in a semi-barbaric state, and the order of rank is of importance due to the democratic mingling of classes and races. The use semi with barbarism gives the feel of not quite integrated for such a state as democracy, but still civilized for such a thing. as if we are in some transitional state of human existence, as well as pointing out how our instincts run in all directions in this kind of chaotic state. Now, we also have a labyrinth of access to unfinished cultures, as the Noble Age never did, pointing out that we have access to all that has been done, yet we still have the ignoble sense. However, as we find previous work, as he mentions Homer, we are able to enjoy such things again because of the ignoble sense we have, which gives the feel of the definition of ignoble being the latter than the former, that we are of humble origin and social status. However, the way he built up to it also gives a sense of not honorable, giving in to more of the feel of being semi-barbaric. Towards the end of the section, he points out that measure is alien to us, that we long for the infinite and unmeasured, but yet still charge forward on our steed for after the infinite. We also only gain a state of bliss when we are in danger. Nietzsche also seems to go against isms that assess according to pleasure and pain. Not so much against, in a sense, he completely thinks it's utterly nonsensical, but that pain and suffering is a part of the human existence. That we also tend to make it worse rather than better. That also looking down on such notions that for the good life not be on the value of pleasure, and that a conscious artist or creative would have pity for them. A pity to see how man diminishes others and himself. He realizes and he's pointing out that we are not able to abolish suffering. In fact, he sees as we would rather increase suffering and make it worse. This pity is also for the creature of man because it has molded in this sense. Nietzsche sees that honesty is not something that a free spirit can be free from, in which I think he puts it best when he says, if our honesty should one day nonetheless grow weary, and sigh, and stretch its limbs, and find us too hard, and like to have things better, easier, gentler, like an agreeable vice, let us remain hard, last of the Stoic, and send this honesty to wherever aid is needed for the devilry in us. We should also not let honesty become a limitation or a form of stupidity. That stupidity gives way to virtue, but also virtue tends towards stupidity. We should be honest, even when it is hard, and have a stoic attitude towards it. However, we should also not let honesty be our demise or hinder ourselves. It's kind of a funny sense, if you ask me. He goes on to say to not let ourselves become bores, and he expresses how bore and that life is too short to become a bore in it, and that if so, you would have to believe in eternal life as well. Then he goes on to express how bored he is with morality. Nietzsche notes that in his time, though, proud as they are with humanness, there is a lot of fear, mainly out of fear of speaking the truth. He even thinks that he might be risking something when he lets the truth escape. Then he goes into cruelty and how we should take another look at it. That we should also look at the fat errors made by ancient and modern philosophies. He gives the feel here that we should not fear criticizing another so that things may be corrected. We should also against thick-witted psychology that had to teach of cruelty and its origin was in the sight of suffering of others. That, however, there might be an overabundant enjoyment in one's suffering, bringing back that it is not always what is good for one is good for another. Nietzsche notes that women want independence, but I feel he kind of scoffs at this, which is more likely a sign of the time when women had few rights. This is noted in him saying that this is the worst development in the general uglification of Europe. He states that they have been repressed more than likely because of the fear of man. Then he starts questioning exactly what are they trying to accomplish. Is she trying to rid herself of the eternal boredom of a woman that he sees they have plenty of? Are women capable of wanting, or can they want, enlightenment? Looking for a new endowment for herself, and does not that pertain to the eternal womanly? He notes that man wants the woman to cease seeking for enlightenment, and that it is man's care and consideration for them that led the church to decree. He does not even see them as a thinking creature. This is expressed by what he sees as their need to be the cook, and yet they do not understand what food means. This is because he sees that they should have gained the major facts of its physiology and even learn how to heal with it. In fact, he sees that a woman who is a bad cook is the reason behind men being the most retarded and most harmed, and that this is a lecture for high school girls. Shortly after, he goes into how she more learns to demand and no longer fear man. That also losing this fear, she loses her womanly instincts. This degenerates women is mainly because of the diminishing of the man. When women take positions such as a clerk, they are regressing, in which blunts the feminine instincts, which Nietzsche sees this as almost a masculine stupidity, but a stupidity all the same. Though he goes on about how women are using the very thing that make them feminine to talk man out of their own feminism is due partly because of the same idiotic men that push them to defeminize so they can imitate the stupidity of man. Now we are moving into the Heidegger and the age of the world picture. Heidegger sees that metaphysics is the reflection of essence of beings and decision concerning truth, with reflection taking courage to question the truth of presuppositions and one's own goals. He sees truth as providing the essential shape that governs the distinctive decisions of the age. Sees that machine technology created by science is not just autonomous transformation, but rather demands employment of mathematical science. With art moving to aesthetics, it becomes an object of experience and considered an expression of human life. Then when culture is understood and practiced as culture, it moves to a realization of the highest values through the cultivation of the highest goods, and which in turn becomes the politics of culture. With the phenomenons ending in the loss of the gods, not in the sense of crude atheism, but in that the world is presented as infinite and unconditioned as the absolute. At that, specifically Christianity becomes up to date to the times, which creates an indecision of what the God or gods should be. Heidegger sees that research establishes itself as a procedure within some realm of beings, whether in nature or in history. He isn't saying it is a methodology, but that it must be done in advance, which opens up the fundamental process of research. That it is the projection of some being within a region that starts a plan in the same sense that a being opens up to something already known, noting that it is the rigor and advancement of securing itself within the realm of being. He notes that the earliest sciences of mathematics, such as physics, remains the same. That, as well, we know mathematics because we look at apples on the table, we can say there are three, which he thinks that apples we recognize, but three is something that is known, and which is something mathematical reserves the name for something numerical. Such that we do not define things in terms of it being numerical, but basically defining an object in nature, and that it is something that is universal, which he uses physics to explain that we describe something specific in advance for something that is already known. Through this physics of know, objects have and are spaced out, which gives the ground plan to making something visible within physical research at each step of investigation that is in advance of what we already know. Basically, When an event occurs within the representation of nature, it can be determined in advance with the spatio-temporal motion by means of numbers and calculation. However, to use such a thing with living beings would be inexact, and therefore would then be no longer living. Therefore, he comes to the conclusion that the procedure in examining such things must be free to view the changeableness of what it encounters, in which, through the over-otherness, as he would say, the particular of the facts reveals itself, but in doing so they become objective. Therefore, the procedure is something that must represent the changeable as it brings something to stand or stop where it is all the while still representing it as something in motion. This is basically stating that when we observe something for research purposes and using mathematics, we make it stop its motion, but at the same time we must represent it as something that is motion. Heidegger states that explanation has two sides. As he puts it, it accounts for something unknown through something known, and at the same time confirms the known through that unknown, which led him to experiment. This is because it takes place in the investigation to that of the field being investigated. That also, research does not start through an experiment, but rather the experiment is only possible because they already know transforming itself into research. With Aristotle, as Heidegger explains, noting that the observation of nature leads us to knowledge of how it behaves, which gives way to a rule, or a rule of nature for that matter. However, this fundamental knowledge of nature is not quite what he thinks is the research experiment notion he is conveying, for it lacks what is decisive about the experiment. The advanced setup of the experiment is to set a law that's in advance, is mastered and calculated with the known to measure the unknown, which creates a standard and restrains the anticipatory representation of the condition, as Heidegger states, in which is not an arbitrary invention, as he points out Newton with the hypothesis, and that postulations are not arbitrarily thought up. So, as the condition occurs, it is sketched into it with the experiment just being a planning and execution in what is postulated as a fundamental law. Heidegger sees here that just as the science's history being made an object, this can only occur when it is something in the past. This can always be done because it is something that has already always been there, and that which can be compared. In comparing everything with everything else, Heidegger puts it, the intelligible is worked out and is certified and secured through the ground plan, which can only be done as far as history can be explained, which in short, the greatness of history cannot be explained but does not mean it is not there, and they explain it as an exception in which makes the great be compared to the ordinary or average. This takes source criticism as research for the objectification of it, and in which alters the approach history has to journalism. Heidegger points out that every science is bounded by its object domain. This means that every science must focus on a particular specialization. This is seen as a necessity of science, in which research is not a random investigation. Then to be recognized, science must be institutionalized. This is because for Heidegger, science is a constant activity, and the institution is needed only because of it. As research is completed, it uses its results to direct further research. This gives the essence of research as a constant activity, as it is based on its own results for its continuation. This gives its own ground for the institutional character. Heidegger notes that what is occurring is nothing less than the establishment of the precedence of methodology over the beings which, at a particular time, are objectified in research. Heidegger sees that, as historical or archaeological research becomes institutionalized, it is no further removed than physics, which pushes towards the scholar no longer being present, It is the researcher and their programs. Which what occurs is the scholar is no longer in the library, but rather always on the move, and the committing to the publisher, that which decides what books need to be written. This changes the sphere in which the researcher resides and into the technologist. This is, according to Heidegger, the only way they can remain real and capable of being effective, in which Heidegger is concerned here with the university only being able to survive for some time in certain places. This is because it makes possible the fragmentation of the sciences into specialties and the unity of the constant activity. Then as science becomes more exclusive, the mastery of the process of work and activities will be shifted into research institutions and professional schools, in which they will never be complete, their modern essence. But if they become serious about their essence, the more readily they will be able to serve the common good. Heidegger is contemplating such things so that to discover its metaphysical ground. When knowledge is through research, it sees beings as something that can be placed at the disposal of representation. This is done when it is able to either calculate either future or retrodict their past, in which nature and history are seen as the same with Heidegger, with the distinction that representations count on nature and take account of history. This creates a sense of beings as objects, which leads to science as research and objectification. Then, science in such way only occurs when truth has transformed into a representation. This is seen an essential phenomenon of modernity, in which humans free themselves from the Middle Ages, in which Heidegger says that it is freeing itself to itself. This leads to the liberation of humanity, introducing subjectivism and objectivism. This interplay occurs because of becoming the subject, in which man becomes that underlying thing that being in truth is found. This led Heidegger to the modern age and the world picture, in which reflecting upon it leads us to the modern world picture. What Heidegger considers this to be is not that of a picture of the world, but that the world is grasped as a picture, which he concludes is so after some questioning of what a world is and what a picture is. This brings him to the realization that the being of beings represent beings, and that if not seen this way, the world picture does not come into view. And that is what made his age a distinct age. That beings sought to be represented and that the world became a picture. That also there is a separation from being a being created by God to being a being that is of a rank in the order of created things and creates this correspondence of the being the cause of creation. In short, by beings, Heidegger means anything that exists at all, natural things, human beings, cultural practices, and even abstract entities. And he argues that in modernity, these beings are allowed to appear only insofar as they can be represented, calculated, and controlled. This changed the worldview from ancient Greece, namely that it went from seeing the world as not an object for the world being an object that beings must be represented. That our reality must be controlled so that we can stand over and against reality. Heidegger ends with the expression that this is everywhere and comes in various forms that distinguish themselves with. However, it is something gigantic. This form seems to press forward to make things such as the numbers of atomic physics disappear. And that in doing exactly what has become, reducing man to the measurable, with everything being calculable, measured, and securing changes the calculable to something that is incalculable, in which covers all things with this invisible shadow because man became the underlying thing that is calculable and the world has become picture. This happens because the world withdraws into a space beyond representation that gives way to its own incalculable. In other words, Heidegger means that there will be a point in which modern calculative thinking expands so much that it becomes too complex and interconnected to be meaningfully understood or controlled. This is no accident. It is the outcome of the worldview that equated being with the representability and mastery. Next, in the last reading that we'll go over, is The Negritude and African Socialism by Singer. He starts by saying that he is telling Britain they have not been criticized for not having a sense of universality, and that they must agree the civilization of the universal, that it will have the fusion of differing civilizations that will bring this about. That this should be brought about, letting people who are hardly have any life beyond themselves bring about the world of energy, and that all peoples and races must first rediscover the profundity of life and not only know it, but be reborn with it. Seeing her sees that this is a new form of racism, in that, in its early stages, it was an anti-racist racism. Singer pushes us to put ourselves in the skin of a black person from 30 years prior to this paper, written in 1988. He sees that this is the only way to get the feel of their situation. When the Latin Quarter, they were filled with things such as pride, passion, and also the naive ignorance of youth. At this time, they were the tabula rasa when being left out of the banquet of the universal, leaving them hope only in the assimilation of themselves. This was a time when ethnology was beginning to be taught in France. Though confined to specialized institutions, Singer praised Oxford University for having the new science of Negro-African ethnology. He also points out other things that matter, such as being among the Latins and being called brother, and recognizing that Negro-African personality in Great Britain and being worthy of fostering and noting that United Kingdom had already given this expression through indirect governmental policy. Singer continues on to give us a bit of a historical context before giving us the actual definition of negritude, which here he expresses how France was the first to force them to seek out its essence, with assimilation being a failure because they could not be black. Therefore, a quest was set forth for this holy grail, in a sense. This is where they found the collective soul. This was not revealed by the official France, but rather by freelance thinkers, in which they learned about the slave trade and how it ravaged their society and destroyed their history, in which they set themselves on the path of racism, in which they stormed the values of Europe, which is summed up as capitalism. At which point, Singer decides to let us in on what negritude is. It is the whole complex of civilized values, precisely the Negro-African world, and getting more specific to the collective soul of coming to grips and self-surrender, that coalescence of subject and object and through myths. Simply put, sense of communion, myth-making, and the gift of rhythm, and is stamped on all works of the black man, in which they took pleasure in being in opposition of the Western civilization and in opposition to the European racialism. Okay, I can see it. Specifically, the Nazis, which is the reason for setting up the anti-racism. I will not go too much into that, but they do point out the hatred and violence that occurred that was in opposition for Africans' need for love. With anthropologists teaching as well that there is no such thing as race, and that they would in the end disappear as a black race. But as biological forces occur, they still are, or they're still here, in which they have a common interest to Europeans in specifying the native values and keeping the values of the others. Singer expresses that the old government systems are out of date, such as colonization, capitalism, federalism, and like its imperialism before it. Singer goes into capitalism noting that it is only fit for the well-being of a minority and that it was forced to reform by the working class to at least provide the minimum standard of living. Obviously, what he means by minority is the people with money, right? With no prospect of being beyond material well-being, with the political, cultural, and spiritual liberties being enjoyed on the surface, not lived, in which he, Singer, sees that there is also a contraction of the free enterprise and that there is a gap between practice and theory, life, and ethics, with freedom being granted to the minority to exploit the majority, and the inability to transcend material bounds, instead transforming into a colonialist imperialism. They were converted to socialism, with having the realization that capitalism sells at the highest price but wants to purchase at the lowest price, further pushing the need for socialism. They create a distinction here from the idea of socialism in these societies and instead call it the African mode of socialism, noting that the exploitation of man has not yet been stamped out. Singer expresses since this has not happened, they had to make an original mode, Negro African mode. This entails a classless society that has a hierarchy and division of labor, with it being a community-based society that is founded on spiritual and democratic values. Decisions are made after the ancestral gods are consulted, and work is shared among sexes and technico-professional groups based on religion. Singer also points out that this society is communal, not collectivist, where people conspire together, even through themselves, through their ancestor with God, who they see as the center of all sinners. With concern in the society on how to prevent the exploitation of man rather than end it, and how to keep the black soul alive rather than how to satisfy cultural needs, which is expressed as spiritual, Singer also sees that scientific research, cooperation, syndicalism, and planning to be used to grow the concept of negritude and turn it into a 20th century socialism. That they should learn from such things instead, as well as expand upon them, such as noting that Marx nowhere dealt with the forms of inequality, and it was omitted, which they had to address by starting with their situation. Then to ensure the earth can be exploited with maximum efficiency, modernization must first be driven by research. It is expressed to be the same with all aspects of the culture, such as its shortcomings and riches, both technical and human, as taken by a survey to learn from. Though cooperation is needed in suppressing private capitalism and taking over the means of production and organizing rationally to obtain a we-won freedom. However, Singer expresses that even after careful consideration of their society, they are still yet to suppress private capitalism. However, he points out that not a single drop of blood was dropped to obtain their independence or their 4-year plan for it. This is because they started by analyzing their situation as an underdeveloped and colonized country. They did this by first winning back their independence and eliminate the flaws of colonial rule while keeping the good aspects of it, such as the infrastructure and the French language that was taught, all while rooting it in negritude by comparing existing systems, by trying to keep the well-being and not the hatred that stemmed from it. Still needing capital, though, they plan to work it in only where needed. Therefore, parting the socialist experiments in Eastern Europe, communist experiments, but keeping the positive achievements when necessary. They also do not refute the neo-humanisms of the old scientific socialism, but instead they revise it. After all is said, Singer sees that the Marxist theory, after being reshaped, is finally set in its true place, noting that it is just one conflict of many against each other. With the example of the technico-professional groups, conflict is gradually resolved with the human tendency to follow, as in Europe and America, pointing out that as well as the American Soviet social systems are becoming closer to each other, though they are enemies. But giving hope, Singer states that conflicts are but the exterior signs of the painful labor from which the future will be born, and he's referring to the Cold War and decolonization. Which brings him to the ends and values, in which Singer notes that Marx left out the fact that man remained free to choose whether to accept or reject progress as he saw fit. The first objective of this end is material well-being and comfort. He notes through a syndicalist view that he could do with reading some good literature. Beyond this objective, man seeks a fuller being, and his end is to satisfy the spiritual needs. This is because they have gone beyond the need of such material, with their hunger being placed in that of love and union, which Singer urges us to imagine a world without love, in which he sees that without would leave the world icebound, powerless to take our souls, in which love and union is seen as the true end to coming into being and a minimal of well-being, and that this socialism is what may be considered as values. As well, if the economy is restricted to frontiers, then it is not viable. In other words, Singer sees that socialism transcends physical comfort, with the values of the fuller already being there, with the allocation of money being allotted to where needed, especially for religious communities and spiritual needs for them, with the technological advancements being that of the values of the civilization of the universal, and that through the United Nations organization that such things lead to the meeting point of all humanity. Singer sees that the NASCO would help build the civilization of the universal by bringing all civilizations together, in which Singer sees that it has started to show that race is a myth, and each society, to sum it up, has its social and cultural history, and the civilizations of antiquity were born at the meeting points of the world, at the world's roads. With this being the culmination of socialization, it will not be of the way of European, Eastern, Western, or by force, but of biological and psychic, and creating symbiosis of the different civilizations according to Singer. Leaving with that, the Negro African has a duty to travel freely with current or row against it. In other words, free to make that choice with body and soul being fulfilled through these things as mentioned. Then know the rapture of love and union, and in the end they will pour it into the burning lava of their negritude, and that if missing, then it would lack the rhythm section of its orchestra and the bass voices of its chore, which is noted by Singer, putting the emphasis on the value of rhythm. As well, seeing it as a form of humanism, Singer sees that the revised socialization will have its counterpart in revised negritude. To end, I would like to ask, what aspects of bureaucracy do you think Singer would use in their socialism? What do you think Nietzsche was getting at overall with virtues? Do you have anything to add to Heidegger's gigantic theory, or do you criticize it?